Welcome to Reducing Risk, a series of podcasts from Medical Protection created specifically for clinicians in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Reducing Risk looks at key medico-legal issues in our jurisdiction and provides helpful advice and guidance on how to manage those risks. Today we are looking at clinicians and social media use for the gathering of clinical information. We have previously done a webinar about social media, so if you're interested, it is on the MPS website. This is an area where many complaints now start and where professional boundaries can blur quickly, so we thought a podcast would be helpful. My name is Chao Yen, and I am an anaesthetist and medico-legal advisor from MPS. Tim and Adam are joining me. Tim is a retired medico-legal advisor and GP, and Adam is partner at our panel law firm, Watt & Carney. Welcome to you both.
Morning, Cheyenne.
Thanks for having me on, Cheyenne.
So we're going to start with talking about seeking advice on social media. In particular, there's lots of Facebook pages that are immense in size, and they say they're closed, but I think that's somewhat falsely reassuring. So Tim, would you be able to talk a little bit about that? I'm sure you've come across some cases.
Yes, well, they may be closed, but that doesn't prevent any of the members of a closed group from then deciding that, that information might be quite interesting to X, Y, and Z. And so the basic principle is once it's out on any sort of social media post, you've got to assume that it could go anywhere, unless you really trust the people who are on that particular site. And yet they're incredibly useful. So instead of having to try and contact someone by phone and they're not answering their phone or whatever, if you want advice, send them a message via whatever system you're using, and get clinical advice. You might have an interesting case that you think your colleagues would learn from. Sharing that with your colleagues can be something very useful. But yeah, ultimately they're not private. And I will remember a case of a young doctor who'd been doing some work overseas, came back to New Zealand. He'd taken a whole lot of photos because it was really interesting, the place he was working in, happened to share a photo of a patient on an operating table, and no identifying names, but the face was quite readily visible. Shared that with a very small group of people that he felt totally comfortable with, and it was a private group, but one of the people in the group thought, actually, this is a breach of privacy, even though it's in a different country and all of those things. And in the end, the employer got to hear about it. Didn't go as far as the medical council, but the doctor was significantly reprimanded for sharing an image of a patient where that patient was recognisable, even though they were in another country.
Oh, wow. So you do
yeah,
have to be careful.
Even when you think you're safe, you may not be.
And actually, because New Zealand's such a small country, I think even identifying factors like, hello there, GP here in Palmerston North, and then you give some description of the patient, someone somewhere might recognise that patient, and then, like you say, it becomes a breach of privacy.
Yeah, absolutely. And the size is definitely a factor. And it's always amazing how the connections that you never think might exist are suddenly there. So the sister of the patient that you're describing happens to be married to one of the people on the group, but you had no idea, and they've shared it, and suddenly it becomes public knowledge because it's recognisable.
Yeah, and I think, even though, like you say, they're closed groups, a group that I know about is, for example, the New Zealand Women in Medicine group. That's got maybe 5,000 members on it.
Mm-hmm.
So, Adam, would you think a group like that can ever truly be closed as such or private?
No, I agree with Tim that if you are putting something on Facebook, even if it is within a group that has administrators that need to admit people or decline admissions, you are disclosing that information. You're taking information that was held by an agency, your GP practice or your hospital, and you as part of that, and you are disclosing it to a wider group of people outside of that agency, it's not relevant that the group you choose to disclose it to, happens to have some boundaries to it. And I think there are both just the practical risks that Tim's already covered, that people may get upset, information may be recognised, and there's an immediate risk of loss of control of what happens to that information next, because people can screen grab it or pass it on, etc. So there's those practical things. And then there's the straightforward legal position, which it is risky to do that. I think clinicians who are choosing to go in writing on a platform like Facebook to seek, reasonably seek professional help, and there's real benefits to that to the patient. Nonetheless, they have to do that with real caution about what they choose to put on the internet. You should be trying to seek help in general terms and putting an absolute minimum of information and try and depersonalize it as much as possible. Even then, it's a grey area. What the law says is that, as you'd expect, there are limits on the disclosure of health information. So if you hold it, there are a lot of rules around when is it okay to disclose that and when is it not okay to disclose that.
Yeah.
It's okay to disclose information if the disclosure is one of the purposes in connection with which the information was obtained. And if it ever came to a lawyer or a debate, there could be a discussion around whether you're genuinely seeking input from colleagues to try and make a clinical decision might fit under that.
So say, for example, the diagnosis is really unclear, and so what if you said to the patient, look, I'm going to seek advice from some of my colleagues. Are you comfortable with me sharing some information about that?
Well, that would be the right way to go about it, because it's far more respectful to ask for permission. And of course, you can always disclose health information if the disclosure is authorised by the individual concerned. So if you have their permission, you have their permission. You're not then forced into a place where you're having to make a legalistic argument about whether it was okay or not. But if it doesn't meet that test of either being authorised or being one of the purposes, then what the Health Information Privacy Code says is you can disclose information that's in an anonymised form, so in a form where the individual concerned isn't identified. But, and this is a really big and important but, only if you believe on reasonable grounds that it's either not desirable or not practicable to obtain authorisation. So you always need to turn your mind first. Am I able just to ask my patient if this is okay?
Yes.
And if they say, and if you can't, if that's an option for you, you can't then default and say, well, I'm just going to do it anyway, but I'll anonymise it and it'll be fine.
Yes.
Right? So I think it's likely that there is material on those sorts of groups that transgresses these rules, for sure. I suspect a lot of it goes under the radar, but there, for the grace of God, go I. You might be the unlucky person whose patient is recognised or who finds out that a close relation is in the same group. So I think it's sensible to be very careful about how you approach those sorts of platforms, because they're not your agency. They are a group of people that will include members who you don't know. Yes. And you are relying on the admins to do a good job of controlling the group, but even a good job of controlling the group doesn't get you around the Health Information Privacy Code and the way that clinicians should approach how they deal with that sort of information.
And I suppose, for example, with a group like the Women in Medicine being so large, there's no way that an administrator can know when a particular doctor has retired and is no longer registered and therefore should no longer be on that group.
That's right.
And they would obviously be quite keen to carry on because, they're obviously interested in the issue still and want to be part of that social group, and yet no longer entitled to have that, receive that information.
Yeah. And also there's a couple of points that I'd like to discuss from what you've talked about, Adam. One of them is when you consent a patient to ask for advice on such a for example, a Facebook group, what would be informed consent in that situation? Because we're talking, you're saying to the patient, would you be happy with me getting advice from a Facebook group with minimal information, but nevertheless the group has got 5,000 members in it. It is a Facebook platform, and I don't know all of those members clearly because it's so large.
Yeah, you can imagine that not when it's presented like that. Perhaps not many patients would say yes.
Yes,
Exactly.
Which is to the point that when you look at it from the patient's perspective and you apply the Health Information Privacy Code framework, you ought to have a big question mark about how you're using those platforms and have a high degree of caution about how you engage with them and what you might post on something like that.
Yeah, and also the other part of the question I had was about storage of that information. So even though it might be the patient might have consented for you to seek information, once you ask, then that information is out there on the platform, stored on the Facebook page.
That's right, and I think that would be part of the informed consent. If you're saying, look, I'll anonymise your case, but I think that we'd get some really helpful feedback if we did X, Y, and Z in terms of consulting a wider group of colleagues. There's a real shift in terms of that information, albeit anonymised, from being within a auditable health record system where there are retention and security rules, as opposed to now being at the mercy of the internet. There for the world to see, anonymised or not, effectively forever, and able to be taken and used by other people as examples of I saw this interesting case on Facebook. I'm going to do a teaching session based on it. Yeah, or put it up in a conference, or it gets bounced to another Facebook page.
That's right.
The possibilities are endless, which is why I think you need to be careful.
And another thing under the code, of course, is that the code requires that when you no longer need the information, you should get rid of it.
That's right.
And that's kind of impossible, isn't it, in these circumstances?
Yeah. So not only is there the Health Information Privacy Code, but as doctors, of course, the Medical Council has a suite of professional standards that the Medical Council's rules, as it were, for how you work professionally. And one of those, which was published in June of 2021, is titled Use of the Internet in Electronic Communication. So it's probably a good idea if you are thinking about engaging with the internet or using Facebook in that way. I'd encourage doctors to click onto the Medical Council website and have a read of that professional standard as another source of professional obligations, or the standards that your conduct may get measured against if there is a notification or a complaint arising out of something that you have posted.
Yes.
And the Medical Council, of course, has a very clear requirement for all doctors to be aware of all of the statements that they produce and to abide by them. Ignorance is not an excuse.
Indeed, you're right, Tim. And doctors many doctors, I think, would be surprised to learn that if you print all these things out and put them in a pile, I think at last count you're up to about 120 pages of discussion and rules about how you ought to conduct yourself. And it is completely understandable given the pressures doctors work under and the prioritization of good patient care and clinical knowledge that if people happen to have a half hour spare in their day, they're more likely to read a recent journal article or do a bit of study on a condition that they've been presented with recently than go and read the council standards. But as you say, ignorance is not a defence. So,
yeah, and on top of that, we work in organisations that also have rules about posting on Facebook. So, do you know of any cases, Tim, where employers have come down quite strongly on?
I can't think of any offhand where that's happened. I'm sure they have, but I can't think of any that I've been involved with.
I can certainly think of cases where, like you mentioned earlier, complaints have arisen because registrars have made comments about various conditions or various patients on Facebook, and then the employer has noticed, or another one of their colleagues have noticed and then reported them. So it's certainly a risky area.
How much is your use of platforms like Facebook or whatever through the official hospital IT systems? How much is that monitored? Do clinicians, are they aware of how frequently that information might be accessed?
I think certainly because we often access Facebook on our personal phones, it's not through the hospital's direct IT system. But if you're on a hospital computer on the intranet, I'm not even sure we can log on to sites like Facebook. From the hospital intranet link anyway.
So the defences that the organisation can put in that regard, but not foolproof if you're carrying your own phone around here.
And also, so along those lines, I've had lots of questions from colleagues about posting clinical information discussions on WhatsApp groups. And I'd be interested in your comments, Adam, around clinicians discussing patient care or hospital safety concerns, processes on WhatsApp groups. Particularly, for example, in my department in anaesthetics, it's a big department. There's about 60 clinicians, and we have a doctors-only WhatsApp group where we know who's on it, but there's just the SMOs in the department. And we'll often talk about things that crop up that are safety concerns, like, for example, processes around emergency bowels not working properly. And there's often the concern that if we discuss these issues and there was an incident or a problem that occurred, for example, if it was directly related to safety bells not working in theatre and someone came to harm and there was a complaint, and someone in the media, for example, made an OIA request around that particular safety feature, is that information then required to be released?
Yeah, I think using tools like WhatsApp and other communication tools is a really fascinating and interesting area. But I'll take a step back. So in the topic we were discussing previously, it was about using things like Facebook, and I think we all agreed that there were some real problems with that, and it perhaps goes so far as to say unwise in most instances. What are the consequences of that? If you get in trouble, there is a potential problem with the privacy commissioner, etc. So you can have a straight privacy complaint. You can have a professional complaint with the medical council. You could have an HDC complaint around treating the patient with respect. And this is where we hook into the issue you've raised, Xiaoyan. You can have an employment issue because what you've done is contrary to your internal employment policies and expectations as an employee of the hospital organisation. And I think with a group of employees using a communication tool, one of the first things I would think the group would want to tick off is, does this comply with our internal policies? Have effectively we asked permission to use this tool as part of our professional practice? That would be the safest way of going about it. And also having some structures around how the group is set up so that there is confidence in having an administrator who will add and remove people to make sure that anyone on the group is a current employee and meets the criteria of being an SMO, etc. And if you leave the organisation, you're promptly removed from the group. There are lots of communication tools that people use and doctors use. I don't think conceptually there should be a problem with that. It's more around how they're being used and having some caution around that. If you are all sitting in a staff meeting as employees of the same hospital discussing safety issues, would there be an issue with that? Of course there wouldn't.
Yeah.
You're discussing information that's important within that agency. The information is not being disclosed outside. If you just use a tool to have that communication, be that a telephone or an email or a WhatsApp, again, it's still an internal agency discussion. I think the only issue I see is that the agency will have wanted to turn its mind to the sort of IT security around WhatsApp as a product and the fact that the information will then live on another set of servers somewhere, even if it's just for a period of time. And also there'll be clinical information that is going onto a personal device, so a doctor's phone. But doctors have personal laptops, which may have clinical information on them if they've put something on their desktop, for example, taken information from out of the Citrix portal and done something else with it. There will be rules, or there ought to be rules that the organisation has about managing that sort of IT security risk. But for me, and I acknowledge other privacy experts may take a different view, but I don't have a problem with using a tool like WhatsApp carefully and appropriately to have clinical discussions.
So if a clinician has assurance from the organisation that they're working within that this is a safe forum for them to be able to share views, then it's the organisation that takes responsibility rather than the individual clinician if something's posted and then somehow leaves that secure site?
No, not quite. I think you can still certainly have individual responsibility in terms of how you handle that information, but you could get an assurance that you're not going to get into trouble from an employment perspective. And if there is a privacy breach, someone has a phone that's not locked that gets picked up by other people when they go through the WhatsApp, it would be, in the first instance, the individual, but then the organisation is going to be liable as well. And the attention will be on both of those entities.
But it would be the person that inadvertently or deliberately released the information who would bear the primary responsibility rather than the person who's posting the information on a supposedly secure platform.
Yeah, I think that's right. if it's all been agreed that it's okay to use this communication tool or something similar to have those discussions, then you should feel free to use it, provided as a receiver or a participant in those conversations, you're complying with what's expected of you about device security, etc. There are tools, I think, and I'm straying a little out of my lane here, on WhatsApp, where, for example, you can have settings in a group that conversations will disappear, that information won't be retained. And I think if you were setting up a WhatsApp group, you might want to turn your mind to whether that's a sensible approach. Is there a need to retain this information on individual devices? Or once the conversation's been had after a short period of time, does that information then disappear?
So specifically, my colleagues have asked me if there's a piece of information on our WhatsApp discussion that's pertinent to an issue that arises later on, and there is an OIA request, will that information need to be disclosed? Will that conversation, if it's not disappeared, need to be disclosed in response to the request?
Probably yes. It depends precisely what's been requested. It's pretty rare for us to deal with Official Information Act requests, and I haven't turned my mind to that legislation for a while to think about the grounds for refusing a request. But certainly in, for example, the Health and Disability Commissioners Act and the Health Practitioners Competence Assurance Act, when you're talking about professional conduct committees, if a clinical incident is being investigated, then there are very clear powers to request information that exists. It's not a defence, or defence is not the right word. It's not a reason to refuse to comply with a formal order to relinquish information to say, oh, well, we really intended that to be a private chat. If medical staff want to have a completely protected forum, then there's a very convoluted and not often used procedure for that. But on the whole, I think the safest thing to go is to go through life thinking, if I've put it in writing, it's far more likely than not that some agency will have a power to be able to order me to hand that over if it still exists.
I see. Yeah.
If the system is there that the information gets wiped after a certain length of time because it's no longer needed, is that a guarantee that the information that is then in the clinicians' heads won't be requested?
Yeah, we sometimes get into debates if we're defending a doctor who's, for example, being investigated by a PCC, where the PCC will initially just ask a set of questions, and it's an amalgam of just wanting information that may exist in a record or just wanting an answer to a question. And we would take the position that if there's a document that exists and it's not legally privileged, for example, then the PCC can exercise its formal powers to request that document. But what they can't do is order a doctor to create a new piece of information by taking what's in their head and putting it down on paper. It really depends on and it can get quite technical and complicated, precisely the context of when you're being asked for what's inside your head and which piece of legislation is being invoked. If, for example, it was an Information Privacy Principle 6 access request for a person's health information, and you knew something but you hadn't put it in writing yet, I think there would probably be a good argument that you would need to would need to take the information from your mind and pass it over, because it is still that person's health information and it is held by the agency in a sense. So it's not a straightforward area of law. There are lots of different pieces of legislation that can be invoked by different organisations for hunting down information. I would just, I guess, circle back to what I said before, which is that in the modern world, if you are putting something down in writing,
anywhere,
you just need to be mindful about that, and make sure that it's appropriate and professional, and that you've thought about the possibility, would I be okay with someone else reading this? A key exception to that is if you are in trouble or something's gone wrong and you call NPS and they put you in touch with a lawyer, then you'll be able to communicate with that lawyer in an entirely safe space, because that communication will be legally privileged. That's the advantage of getting a lawyer involved where there is a problem.
And I guess that then it sort of comes back to another point that we'd like to emphasise, is that if things have gone wrong and you're aware that they've gone wrong, seeking help early is the right thing to do. The last thing you want to do is to try and manage it on your own for a while, sort of say things that perhaps weren't to your best advantage later on, and then get help and find that it would have been better to have got help early. So certainly that's always been the MPS recommendation, is if something's going wrong, seek advice early about it.
Great advice.
Excellent. So, going back a little bit, if we're going to seek clinical advice on any kind of social media platform, a safe way of doing it would be to consider not to do it and to follow a proper clinical pathway where you pick up the phone, call a clinical colleague of the appropriate specialty that you want to seek advice from, so that you can document that advice properly and have acted in accordance with what's expected in your professional capacity. That
old-fashioned way of going about things is going to immunise you from an awful lot of professional risk. And the other thing which we talked about is involving the patient in the decisions you're making. You know, if you're going to, you've got a really rare case and you want to phone the Royal Melbourne Children's Hospital, talk to your patient about it. You know, we don't see much of this here. I'm aware that there's, a colleague who I've met at a conference in Australia who might have a good perspective. Are you happy for me to talk to that person about your case?
And there are also scenarios where, there may have been an incident that occurred, and that there's a lot of facts about that incident that would be useful for your colleagues to know. So you might ask your patient, look, I'm a member of a peer review group. I think this would be really useful for my peer group to have this information so that they're aware of this danger and so that other people don't get affected by it. Are you okay about me mentioning this anonymously to my peer review group? Should we record that we've got consent?
I haven't thought about that before, Tim. I mean, if perhaps as a matter of best practice, yes. I don't think there's any harm in recording consent for sure, because if the patient's perspective changes later on, you've got a record of it. I mean, you can imagine that we don't see a lot of cases of patients getting angry because they gave permission for their case to be anonymously discussed in a peer review group and they've changed their minds. I think there's a pretty low risk sort of situation, but there's seldom a reason not to document a clinical discussion.
Yeah. It's interesting with consent, isn't it? Because 10 or 15 years ago, things that we now think, oh yes, consent is a really good thing to have, or even a necessary thing to have. 10 or 15 years, that was never a consideration. We didn't even have to think about whether we'd get consent for something. So it's a changing field. Mm.
Yeah. And also just going back to our topic about whenever you write something down, just be mindful that can be used in other ways. If there's an IA request, it might be required to be released. I can certainly think of an example where one of our members sought our help because they had discussed a patient in text message, and then there was an IA request, and so that information needed to be released. So anything that you write down, even though it's on a personal device, might need to be released. And in that situation, there was, because of that, they're part of an organisation, there were organisational rules about using your personal device for clinical information. So they had to go through an educational process for that too. So we need to be mindful that, like you say, anytime you write something down, just be careful.
Yeah. And look, it's not uncommon for, in my experience, organisational rules to be more conservative than actual practice. Things may be happening and totally normal in the department that when you really sit down and read your employment policies, they may not be okay. And it's like the Medical Council's professional standards. It may well be hard to find the time to sit down and read those
100-odd pages
of Te Whatu Ora IT policy, but they still apply and they still are the rules. Once something goes wrong, the first thing all the lawyers will do is pick up the rules and figure out which ones apply and have they been complied with.
So if we're going to summarise, I think our view would be that before putting anything that's patient-related out on social media, you'd want to think really carefully about it. Do I really need to do this? Is there another way that I could get the information that I'm looking for? What are the potential downsides before you hit that send button? Because once it's out there, it can't be brought back. So
100%.
Think carefully. And there are lots of people, as Adam has pointed out, who, if something does go wrong, will have an interest in making your life particularly miserable for often a long period of time. So, and that's not to be recommended.
No. So seek advice early if you're in trouble as well.
Indeed.
All right. So we've discussed a lot about social media use in terms of seeking clinical advice, and we're going to stop there, and then in part 2 of this podcast we're going to talk about posting our personal opinions and comments on social media as doctors and what to watch out for when doing that. And we're also going to discuss how to deal with reviews posted on social media by patients. So please join us for part 2. And thank you for listening to this podcast. I hope it's been helpful to you. Our podcasts provide information of a general nature. If you would like advice on a specific case and you are our member, please contact us on 0800 2255 677 option 3 or 0800 call MPS during business hours. We look forward to catching up with you in our next podcast. If you like the Medical Protection podcasts, please subscribe and leave a review. If you would like a podcast on a specific topic, please email nzpodcasts@medicalprotection.org.